the way you do it. You play the guitar on the MTV. That ain't working, that's the way you do it. Take money for nothing and your chicks for free. Now that ain't working, that's the way you do it. Let me tell you, damn guys ain't dumb. Maybe get a blister on your little finger. Maybe get a blister on your thumb. We got to install microwave ovens, custom kitchen deliveries. We got to move these refrigerators. We got to move these color TVs.
Now let's examine a hypothesis that is seemingly ridiculous. Could the entirety of the Apollo images have been created in the controlled environment of interior or exterior studio sets? As the sheer magnitude of achieving such a task without being discovered or denounced would appear to be beyond the bounds of possibility, most people are quick to laugh this hypothesis off as an example of conspiracy theory run amok. Yet before we dismiss it so readily, let's remember that it's initially easier to dismiss outrageous ideas even if they should eventually be proven correct. Simply because we might not want to face up to uncomfortable truths, and because to acknowledge that truth would make us look complete fools. It is apparently okay to acknowledge the lack of authenticity of the visual information surrounding an event safely buried in the relatively distant past, such as the sinking of the Lusitania by 3 torpedoes.
This event, which had the effect of bringing America into the First World War, happened out of sight of a British newsreel camera. But that detail didn't stop the media creating a fake scene, shot on a London pond, and presenting the result to the public as the authentic coverage of that incident.
As an example of the deliberate withholding of information at the turn of the century, we learned that the prime cause of the horrific accident that led to the demise of the Hindenburg was not hydrogen, as ruled after the accident, but was actually the nature of the fabric covering the dirigible. It's now clear that this outer fabric was known at the time to have been highly inflammable. The fact that the constructors then continued to use a medium known to be potentially lethal is of no surprise to an industry that has spawned its own series of disasters.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
Challenger, go and throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And as we're finding out, what worked for the past masters of aeronautics is seemingly still valid. Would it have been possible to pull off the task of faking the record?
To create a set of stills and the TV coverage on the scale of Apollo would certainly require considerable resources. It would also need an exciting storyline full of dramatic events and human interest, requiring scriptwriters, actors and costumes. These would then need studios, cameras, lighting and of course sets. But we suggest that all preparations and making the pre-recorded TV coverage took place over such a long period and was so woven into the everyday life of the Apollo space program that even though this particular odyssey was made literally under the very noses of innocent employees and contractors, the fact that the final cut was phony went undetected at the time.
Returning to the matter in hand, Apollo and the moonwalkers, is there any evidence that mountain backgrounds used in the Apollo imagery could possibly have been multiple-use artificial backdrops?
There appear to be some blatant discrepancies in the location of the LEM in relation to the surrounding landscape in Apollo 17. There seem to be some serious multiple uses of mountain backdrops. Any given background can be the same size irrespective of the scale of the scene. This is often the case despite the varying distances that the photographers, their equipment and the LEM were supposed to be from any of these mountain backdrops. The EVA route at the Taurus-Littrow Valley, the areas where the two astronauts allegedly drove their roving vehicle and then walked on foot, extends many miles away from the landing site towards the lower region of this map. This is the landing spot at Taurus-Littrow. As the camera pulls back, we can see that all these mountains are located well away from the LEM's landing site. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to some rather peculiar features in the mountains of Taurus-Littrow that appear in the record. In the background is a rather distinctive mountain with a steepish slope on the left and a gradual slope off to the right. Centrally positioned is a light-coloured mound and an interesting mini crater feature inset above it. And over to the right is another mound with a larger, darker crater-like feature. We'll be seeing more of this mountain and the mounds in the sequences that follow. Here again is the light-coloured mound on the left, and in the centre the second mound with its larger, darker crater-like feature. Notice in the left foreground are some experiment packages. And now with the LEM in the foreground, you'll recognise the mound with a dark crater-like feature. We have confirmation of the LEM's apparent close proximity to this location by way of this image as well. Note the two key features, the light-coloured mound on the left and the second mound with a darker feature to the right. But when we look again at the wide view of the valley with an astronaut standing by the large split rock, we can see there's no apparent sign whatsoever of the LEM in relation to the scale of the mountains we were looking at in the previous image. Here's another view, this time looking over Split Rock. Notice the crater in the centre, with no obvious sign of the lunar module at all. We now return to the Split Rock location, and an even wider composited image revealing an area to the right of the boulder. Surprisingly, this is the area in the centre of the picture, where the LEM is supposed to have landed. Look how tiny it is in relation to the setting and the surrounding mountain landscape. What anomalous scaling compared with the close-up view of the LEM we saw earlier. As we bring the centre larger, notice how small the LEM looks in relation to what appear to be absolutely enormous mountains. Returning to the footage we saw previously, compare the mountains seen in the TV coverage with those in this still photograph. They're virtually identical, yet the LEM is absent from the still image and present in the TV coverage. Let's take a closer look at other imaging anomalies at this site and the continuity of the LEM in relation to its backgrounds. This wide view is looking across the Taurus-Littrow Valley with a distinctive mountain, a light-coloured mound and the little feature above it. Now as we mix through to the TV coverage, the LEM is clearly at the same location. Compare this still image from which the LEM is absent with what is obviously the same location where the LEM is present. Although the lighting has changed, the mountain is recognisably the same. All very surprising, because earlier we registered that the LEM was absent from this spot. We also noted that the LEM had apparently landed well away from these mountains. But in this TV freeze, we see exactly the same mountain yet again, with the LEM.
Have the mountains been moved to suggest a different location between one set of images and another, cost saving on scenic backgrounds, or has the LEM itself been moved?
It looks as though the mountains were moved around. You see, money was no object with Apollo, so we must conclude that this action is a further example of intentional whistleblowing by those involved. I'm now going to run a 360-degree TV panorama sequence at that location. Identified as EVA-1, Site 1, it was shot from the rover's TV camera, remotely operated from Mission Control. Notice the shadow of the LEM in the foreground and the pair of mountains in the distance. But these appear to be mountains with unique qualities. We saw earlier that this distant view, seen on the TV coverage, is the location of the LEM, here in the middle distance. So how can the same view possibly exclude the LEM? As we continue with the panorama, we should return to the point where we started, with the distinctive mountain in the background and the LEM in the foreground. However, that doesn't happen, as we'll see. We can state with confidence that this part of the 360-degree panorama that we've extracted from another take, EVA2, Site 5, is intended to suggest a different location in the valley. But here's the distinctive mountain with a lighter coloured mound. And the LEM? Surprise, surprise, there's no sign of the LEM whatsoever this time. Either the LEM was moved away, or this is a studio set with movable mountain elements forming the background to the foreground action. These continuity discrepancies cannot be explained in any other way. The clue to ascertaining what may have actually occurred lies in establishing that the darker markings on the left-hand side of the background mountain are common to all these images. NASA would have us believe that these pictures were taken many miles apart, but if that were the case, the perspective of the mountains would vary drastically. On the contrary, the markings on the left side of the distinctive mountain remain constant. They're in the same place in relation to this steepish slope on the left, in every case. Put another way, in relation to this slope, these markings should move to the right as one moves further to the left of the valley. But the only noticeable difference is that this mound to the right changes its position, revealing the mound with a darker inset feature, but other elements of the scene do not substantially change in any of these views. Despite the fact that the LEM is supposed to have landed well away from any mountains, in the images with astronauts present, the mountain backdrops are never very far away at all.
So why do images with action in the foreground have backgrounds that appear so close?
No doubt this situation is the consequence of limitations imposed by working in a studio environment, without the benefit of backgrounds miles away, as would have been the case at the true location. It was possible, though, to create the illusion of a vast landscape for some of the impressive scene-setting imagery, especially the stills. Here again is the TV coverage of the LEM's supposed landing site, emphasizing that the location is nowhere near the mountains that form the backdrop to the previous images. This picture of the LEM, so close to its background, cannot possibly relate to the suggested location of the LEM in this image. The distance scaling discrepancies in the various backgrounds gives it all away. Yet more examples of inconsistencies in the record.
Is there any further evidence of mountains being moved around? And is it possible to detect any joins in the working area which could show telltale breaks, say, between the studio floor, the surface area and vertical mountain background?
Yes. In virtually every case, whether stills imaging or TV coverage, we can see just such a join line between the key elements, the horizontals and the verticals. In our view, had these images been taken in a natural location, this obvious join line would not be in evidence. And here in this illustration, you can clearly see how the working area and the mountain background with its supports would be separated, resulting in just such a join line showing up in the images as an obvious break. Rather significantly, in the 1971 James Bond movie, Diamonds Are Forever, when Bond penetrates the Willard White tectonic site in the desert outside Las Vegas, Nevada, he eventually finds himself on an interior moon set, surrounded by 3 separate levels of movable flats depicting lunar mountains. We also see the wooden supporting structure of these mountain backgrounds, a gallery full of sound, light and computing equipment, as well as actonauts practicing slow-mo movements.
Get him off that machine, that isn't a toy.
And finally, when Bond escapes on a hybrid of a rover and a LEM through the flimsy wall of this moon set, we see that he's emerging from the grey-domed building that looks remarkably like the northern hemisphere of the moon. This entire scene is, without doubt, whistleblowing on a very grand scale.
So, David Percy considers that Bond sequence to be whistleblowing. But surely one scene in a film does not a true story make. This single scene could be construed as an amused nod of the head on the part of the filmmakers to the Apollo hoax theory that was already circulating by 1970. That having been said, there's no doubt at all that author Ian Fleming had his finger on the pulse of world events. Through his intelligence contacts, he kept abreast with both Soviet and American rocket technology and received technical updates and advice from the British Interplanetary Society.
It is quite clear that Diamonds Are Forever contains information as to how the Apollo, witnessed by the world, was actually staged. Either the whole film script was totally inspired, or someone in the know clearly seeded information into the film. For although the original book storyline would have worked very well for the movie, new situations were grafted onto Fleming's principal locations. This film contains a multitude of relevant covert references to the anomalies in the Apollo program. Another example concerns the dangers of radiation. In a very memorable scene, immediately prior to the interior moonset sequence, in Diamonds Are Forever, Bond highlights the subject of radiation.
Hello.
Hi,
Haven't seen you here before.
I'm Klaus Hergesheimer.
New here.
I've been here 3 years. G-section.
How are things in G-section?
Still the same old grind, you know. Checking radiation shields for replacement. Hey, by the way, where's yours?
I've been waiting a couple of days for you guys to deliver them.
Oh, gee, I'm sorry. You should have given us a phone call. Here, look, I've got one here. Lucky for you, I carry spares. Now, you keep that on. You can't be too careful about radiation.
Absolutely. I feel much safer with this on.
See you around.
Who are you? What do you want?
Klaus Hergesheimer, G-section. Just checking on radiation shields. Now, let me see. You are,
Professor Dr. Metz. Our shields are fine. Now get out.
Thank you very much.
We will be looking at the hazards of space radiation later in the programme. The movie Diamonds Are Forever is confirmation, though, that some works of fiction can communicate vital clues. Producing an Apollo sound and light show in a studio would naturally imply the use of moving image creation and sound recording facilities.
Using conventional motion picture film for the pre-creation of the live TV coverage would have been very risky, as film could easily get scratched or even break during transmission. The best material for the purpose would have been videotape. This was not widely used in the 60s, but it was in use by NASA and the US government. Using an emerging technology would enable the perpetrators of a hoax to pull off the trick with impunity. Don't forget, in the 1960s, the networks had to film off TV screens during the transmissions. Today, this is an aspect of the Apollo story that many engineers and producers find highly suspect. The best result would have been to provide the networks with a direct video feed, but they did not do that.
So we now have to ask, could early video equipment have been used in the generation of the live TV coverage of Apollo?
We did use early videotape machines, Ampex VR660, and later on an Ampex VR1100, the quad tape machine. And we kept those tapes on site for quite a long time. We received that FM carrier down on the Earth, ran it through an FM demodulator, and processed it in an RCA scan converter that took the slow scan picture and converted it to the American standard black and white television signal, and then sent that on to Houston. When we were converting from slow scan to fast scan, RCA used the disc in the scan recorder as a memory, so it played back the same video several times until it got updated video.
In other words, the incoming signal was recorded onto a magnetic disc for black and white TV. And for colour, it had first to be recorded onto tape recorder 1, then played back on tape recorder 2. Only then could there be a conventional colour TV picture.
The idea that what we all saw on our screens in July 1969 was actually live from the moon recedes by the minute. Are there any indications that the moonwalk sequences were actually filmed on Earth under studio conditions? And how difficult would it have been to simulate the moon's 1/6 gravity?
Researchers have noticed that when the rover was filmed driving across the dusty surface, the dust thrown up by the rover's wheels clumps, just as it would if it were driven in a location where there's an atmosphere. Had the rover really been performing in a vacuum, the lunar conditions, not only would the dust have sprayed out in a perfect and progressive parabolic arc, but due to the reduced gravity, this arc would have risen up to 6 times higher than it would have done on Earth. This Apollo footage records the dust actually being stopped in its tracks as it encounters an atmosphere.
The moon has a much lower surface gravity, like it's 1/6 of the surface gravity on the Earth. So pictures of falling things, you see things moving, falling slowly, and you see people moving about as if they don't weigh very much. So faking these motion pictures, and remember that many of the pictures returned from the Apollo project were motion pictures, that really show people operating in an environment where they weigh, their equipment weighs about 1/6 of what it would on the Earth. So it's really very difficult to fake in a studio on the Earth, where the gravity would of course be normal.
In the 1999 revised edition of Apollo, From the Earth to the Moon, an astronaut is heard to say, "There's no dust at all," which is only possible if the exercise is taking place on a hard surface.
9 miles an hour. Like you see, I'm going to have to keep my eyes on the road.
However, there are carving lines through the loose surface coating.
Up a little rise. There's no dust at all. Steering is quite responsive.
And if there are tracks in the surface coating, then there should also be significant movement of surface material arcing out from under the wheels of the rover. In this respect, the new sequence is in direct contrast to the original 16mm Apollo camera footage. The statement, "there's no dust," doesn't even belong with this action, but with the earlier arrival of the LEM. The rewriting of the record, for which there is allegedly already authentic documentation, does not in any way help to preserve the real credentials of the original. It only demonstrates that in a probable attempt to avoid the scandal of the millennium, NASA has chosen to support a revised edition of Apollo. But in our view, the agency has chosen poorly. Astronauts moving in slow motion is another hallmark of the Apollo TV footage. There is no evidence at all of any astronaut making a leap or a jump anywhere near a height commensurate with 1/6 G possibilities. But if they were actually simulating EVAs on Earth, they would then need help with their bulky heavyweight suits and backpacks in order to achieve the visual effect of moving around easily in lunar gravity. So enter wire supports. This is a tried and tested way of relieving weight from performers or even flying an actor. Here is a sequence from one of our own productions.
Excuse me, will I need a car?
Relax, Chris. We're only making a short journey back to 1969, to the beginning of Unix.
Of course, confirmation that wires were used is in the detail. Here in this Apollo 14 footage, you can see a ping, a momentary glint. And again, run slowly. And once more. There are other examples too. This one is from Apollo 17 during the flag scene. You can see the ping at the top of the frame. In this footage from Apollo 16, we have telltale evidence of a slightly floating or dangling effect at the jump salute location. It's as if the weight is being taken off the astronaut's feet just a second or so too soon. Compare that sequence with an obvious rehearsal rig. The dangling effect is very evident. And here again, from the same mission, Apollo 16, we have an astronaut who is about to get up.
Give me a hand. Okay, here we go.
"Let me give you a hand," he says.
There goes bag. There goes another bag. Bag. Coming.
Look at it again. The astronaut is getting up with the wire taking the weight, relieving him of 5/6 of the Earth's gravity. A magic trick? No, just the help of a wireman. This is a slow-motion jump that would have been seen live on TV. And here it is at normal speed. The well-rehearsed, pre-recorded material was apparently slowed down by 50% when we saw it on TV. And yes, we've done the necessary work to establish that percentage.
How was the slow motion effect achieved?
Well, creating these 1/6 slow simulations would have been a relatively straightforward process. First, the scene would have been photographed and recorded onto videotape at the normal rate in the US, 30 frames per second. On playback, the recording would have been slowed down to half speed. As each video frame is made up of 2 different fields, this will give 60 different frames of image per second, because each individual field now becomes a frame. We must remember that the live TV transmissions were filmed off TV screens for posterity. The archiving of the Apollo moonwalks was on 60mm film, just like this. Movie film has an entirely different makeup to that of a videotape recording. Film only has frames and not fields. So when the resulting footage was filmed off a TV screen, the fact that the playout of the original video was slowed down to half speed would have gone totally undetected and remain virtually undetectable. Now this is how the jump salute would have looked at normal speed before being slowed down by the method just described. Looks rather like it would on Earth, does it not? The video equipment used in Apollo was early generation. Therefore it would have been recorded onto 2-inch tape, the state of the art in the 1960s.
If you remember, there was a beautiful piece of footage from the Apollo 15 mission where the astronauts demonstrated the surface gravity on the moon by holding a hammer in one hand and a feather in the other. Now, it was proved in physics a long time ago that objects fall at the same speed. It doesn't matter how heavy they are, and a feather will fall at the same speed as a hammer. And the only reason that the feather doesn't fall at the same speed as a hammer in this room is because the resistance of the air in the room slows down the feather. If you do this experiment on the moon, they both fall together. And this piece of footage that shows this done by the camera pointing at the astronaut, dropping the hammer and the feather, and sure enough, they both fall together. And that proves immediately that this experiment was done in a vacuum. So this movie set would have to have been evacuated. It would have to be a vacuum. But more than that, the 2 objects fall slowly. They would fall 6 times faster on the Earth because the gravity is stronger. You see them fall slowly on the moon.
And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our Falcon, and I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
This is also a very difficult image to fake.
Well, actually, it isn't at all difficult to fake. NASA itself would repeat the very same trick, this time officially in the 1999 story From the Earth to the Moon. This time the astronaut held the hammer the other way up, so that we could see it was not the same fakery as the first time. Of course, that original demonstration by Apollo 15 doesn't in any way prove that it had taken place on the moon. Before NASA reenacted the whole thing officially, we had already conducted our own experiment. Here we are in our London studio in 1G, complete with an atmosphere, and without the benefit of a vacuum chamber. There they go. As you can see, the feather and the hammer arrive on the ground at the same time. Now if we slow it down by the appropriate amount, lo and behold, these 2 items fall nice and slowly as per a 1/6 G environment. This illusion is all about calibration.
Following their research, Bennett and Percy have arrived at a firm conclusion regarding the reason for the anomalies and inconsistencies found in both the stills and TV coverage of Apollo.
All the apparent mistakes that we've observed are, in our view, deliberate. We think it's very possible that some of those who were involved in the design and execution of the sets, the photography, lighting and production were perhaps very distressed when they realized what they were expected to do under the guise of service to their employers and their government. For NASA is a government agency, and their contractors grade their staff with security clearances in the same way as the military do. It is possible that instead of courting what could be life-threatening danger by standing up and blowing a whistle in public, these brave souls encoded their work with deliberate mistakes that will be detected sometime in the future, long after the emotion of the event had cooled.
What does Una Ronald, who was in Western Australia at the time, think about these attempts at fakery?
When I saw the Coke bottle, for me, the whole moon landing from that point was a fake. It was a setup. And if it was a setup, it must have been filmed somewhere on Earth. And it would have been filmed, to my way of thinking, in America, at some lonely site, or alternatively in a huge indoor set, somewhere where they could be private, be secluded, be able to produce this quite passable picture of someone walking on the moon.
Most of us will recall that famous movie Capricorn 1, featuring 3 astronauts who are hoisted out of the launch rockets at the last minute to be informed that the technology won't get them to Mars safely. So in the interests of maintaining the space program, they must take part in the simulation of their voyage to Mars. Less well known is the fact that one of the originators of this storyline was Bill Kaysing, and that the destination of the original story was not Mars, but the moon.
People at an extremely high level came up with the entire simulation, which was then filmed in Las Vegas in Area 51 at the northeast corner of what used to be the Atomic Energy Test Station there, and also at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino.
The convincing evidence presented so far in this program strongly suggests that the TV coverage and the photographic record of Apollo is faked.